Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of mystery, history, and the supernatural. This narrative aims to provoke curiosity, inspire wonder, and remind us that some truths defy simple explanation. You're looking at a photograph from 1888, taken outside the Carter farmstead in Millbrook Township, Pennsylvania. At first glance, it shows three brothers standing before their barn on a crisp October morning. Samuel, the eldest at 26, stands center with his hands clasped behind his back. To his left, Thomas grips a pitchfork, its metal tines catching the early sunlight. On the right, young Benjamin, barely 18, poses with arms crossed over his chest. The image sat in the family's possession for 37 years without incident. It wasn't until 1925 that Samuel's daughter, while organizing her father's effects, noticed something impossible. Benjamin's shadow fell backward at a sharp, unnatural angle, as if his spine had snapped. His body in the photograph stood straight and proud, but the shadow told a different story entirely. What made this discovery particularly disturbing was the way Benjamin had died. On November 15th, 1888, just 3 weeks after the photograph was taken, he fell from the barn loft. His body was found twisted at precisely the same broken angle as his shadow in the image. The county coroner, Dr. Elias Thornfield, recorded the death as accidental. But the shadow had known something the living world had not yet witnessed. Experts who later examined the photograph could offer no rational explanation for the discrepancy. The glass plate negative, stored in the basement of Millbrook's only photography studio, showed the same impossible detail. What you're about to hear challenges everything we understand about light, shadow, and time itself. This is the case of the Carter brothers' prophetic photograph, an image that somehow captured not just a moment, but a glimpse into an inevitable future. The question that haunts investigators to this day is simple yet terrifying. Can a shadow know something that hasn't happened yet? And if so, what other secrets might be hiding in plain sight within our most cherished family portraits? The Carter family kept detailed records, never suspecting their most innocent possession held such dark knowledge. In the margins of Benjamin's diary, found after his death, he had written repeatedly about strange dreams. Dreams where he felt himself falling, always falling, his back breaking against invisible ground. The last entry, dated 3 days before his death, contained only 5 words. The photograph had been trying to warn them all along, but they simply hadn't known how to listen. You're looking at evidence that some moments cast shadows, both backward and forward through time. The question isn't whether Benjamin's fate was sealed when the shutter clicked. The question is whether we're brave enough to examine our own family photographs with the same scrutiny. What futures might already be written in the play of light and shadow around those we love? What if every photograph is actually a prophecy, waiting for someone to notice what the shadows already know? The autumn of 1888 in rural Pennsylvania was marked by unusually heavy rains and an early frost. Photography was still a luxury for farming families, requiring a journey to town and a considerable expense. The Carter brothers had commissioned their portrait from Ezra Whitmore, Millbrook's only professional photographer. Whitmore operated from a converted grain store on Main Street, using the large windows for natural light. His equipment included a Scoville camera and imported glass plates from the Eastman Company. The session was recorded in Whitmore's ledger, discovered in 1943 during renovation of the building. According to his meticulous notes, the brothers arrived at precisely 2:30 in the afternoon on October 24th. The weather was clear, with strong directional sunlight coming from the southwest. Whitmore noted that Benjamin seemed unusually restless during the positioning, shifting his weight repeatedly. The photographer had to remind the youngest Carter brother 3 times to hold still for the exposure. In the margins of that day's entry, Whitmore had added an unusual observation. He wrote that Benjamin's shadow appeared uncommonly dark compared to his brother's. At the time, Whitmore attributed this to the boy's nervous energy and fidgeting. The exposure lasted exactly 45 seconds, standard for outdoor photography in good light. What Whitmore couldn't have known was that he was documenting something beyond his understanding of physics. The Carter family paid their fee of $2 and received their photograph 3 days later. They displayed it proudly on the mantelpiece of their farmhouse parlor. For decades, visitors admired the formal composition and clear detail of the image. No one thought to examine the shadows closely until that November day in 1925. Samuel's daughter, Margaret, was preparing to sell the family farm after her father's death. She had been carefully wrapping each photograph for storage when the anomaly caught her eye. The afternoon sun streaming through the parlor window illuminated the photograph at just the right angle. That's when she saw what no one had noticed for 37 years. Benjamin's shadow didn't match his pose, his stance, or the laws of nature. Margaret immediately contacted the Millbrook Historical Society, seeking an explanation. The Society's president, Professor Harold Blackwood, examined the photograph under magnification. His initial assessment, recorded in a letter dated December 3, 1925, was deeply troubled. Blackwood wrote that the shadow violation was impossible according to all known principles of optics. He recommended consulting with experts from the Pennsylvania College of Photography in Philadelphia. What they would discover would challenge every assumption about the relationship between light and shadow. The photograph wasn't just a family keepsake anymore. It had become evidence of something that shouldn't exist. How can a shadow tell a story that the body hasn't lived yet? Benjamin Carter woke on the morning of November 15, 1888, with his back already aching. His diary entry from that day, written in his careful script, described the sensation precisely. "The pain feels like a memory of something that hasn't happened," he wrote. His brothers found him unusually quiet during breakfast, staring out the kitchen window toward the barn. The morning chores proceeded normally until approximately 10:45, when Benjamin climbed to the loft alone. He had gone up to check the hay stores before the predicted storm arrived that afternoon. Samuel and Thomas were mending fence posts in the south pasture, well within earshot of the barn. At 11:17, they heard a sound that Samuel later described as like a tree branch snapping in winter. The sound was followed by a heavy thud that seemed to shake the entire structure. They found Benjamin at the base of the loft ladder, his body twisted in an impossible position. His spine had snapped at the exact same angle shown by his shadow in the photograph. Dr. Thornfield arrived within the hour, summoned by a neighbor who had heard Samuel's cries. The physician's examination, recorded in his private medical journal, noted several disturbing details. Benjamin's injuries were consistent with a fall of at least 20 feet, yet the loft was only 12 feet high. More puzzling still, there were no signs of impact on the hay bales that should have broken his fall. The ladder showed no evidence of structural failure or any reason for Benjamin to have lost his grip. His hands were clean, with no splinters or marks suggesting he had tried to catch himself. Dr. Thornfield wrote that it appeared as though the young man had simply surrendered to gravity. The coroner's inquest, held 3 days later, attracted unusual attention from the county seat. Judge William Morse presided over testimony from both brothers and several neighbors. Samuel testified that Benjamin had been climbing that same ladder daily for over 5 years without incident. Thomas confirmed that the weather was calm, with no wind that might have caused instability. The most disturbing testimony came from neighbor Silas Fletcher, who lived a quarter-mile away. Fletcher swore he had seen Benjamin fall not once, but twice that morning. He claimed the first fall occurred at exactly 10:55, followed by the fatal fall 22 minutes later. When pressed for details, Fletcher insisted he had watched Benjamin's body hit the ground, then rise and climb again. The judge dismissed Fletcher's testimony as the confused recollection of an old man. But Fletcher's written statement, preserved in the county records, included one chilling detail. He described Benjamin's body falling at the same broken angle both times. The inquest concluded with a verdict of accidental death, but questions lingered in the community. Benjamin was buried in Millbrook Cemetery on November 18th during a fierce thunderstorm. His gravestone, carved by local mason Theodore Crane, bore only his name and dates. But Crane later told his grandson that something strange had happened during the carving. Every time I tried to chisel the date of death, the stone seemed to resist the tools. Professor Harold Blackwood arrived in Philadelphia on December 15, 1925, carrying the Carter photograph in a leather portfolio. His appointment was with Dr. Marcus Feldman, chair of the Optical Sciences Department at Pennsylvania College. Dr. Feldman had studied photographic anomalies for over 2 decades, documenting cases of double exposures and chemical irregularities. But he had never encountered anything like the Carter brothers' image. Under laboratory conditions, using a microscope manufactured by the Spencer Lens Company, Feldman examined every inch of the photograph. His assistant, Miss Eleanor Hartwell, recorded their observations in precise detail. The glass plate negative, retrieved from Whitmore's abandoned studio, showed identical shadow discrepancies. This ruled out any possibility of later manipulation or chemical damage to the print. Feldman's measurements revealed that Benjamin's shadow fell at a 127-degree angle from vertical. For this to occur naturally, the sun would have had to be positioned behind and below the subject. Yet Samuel and Thomas's shadows fell correctly for southwestern afternoon light. The shadows existed in the same photograph but responded to different light sources. Dr. Feldman's report, submitted to the American Journal of Optical Sciences, was rejected for publication. The editor's response, dated February 3, 1926, stated that the findings were physically impossible and therefore scientifically invalid. Undeterred, Feldman consulted with Professor James Whitfield of the Boston Institute of Technology. Whitfield specialized in temporal mechanics, a nascent field exploring the relationship between light and time. His analyses, conducted using a spectroscopic device of his own design, yielded disturbing results. The shadow in question showed spectral properties inconsistent with reflected sunlight. Instead, it exhibited characteristics similar to phosphorescent material, exposed to prolonged darkness. Whitfield theorized that the shadow was somehow casting itself from a different moment in time. His calculations suggested the shadow originated approximately 3 weeks in the future. This would place its source at the exact moment of Benjamin Carter's death. The implications were staggering. The photograph had somehow captured light from an event that hadn't yet occurred. Professor Blackwood returned to Millbrook with more questions than answers. He interviewed Samuel Carter extensively, seeking any detail that might explain the anomaly. Samuel revealed that Benjamin had been having vivid nightmares for weeks before the photograph was taken. In these dreams, he repeatedly fell from great heights, always landing in the same twisted position. Benjamin had also complained of feeling watched even when alone in open fields. He told his brothers that his shadow sometimes seemed to move independently of his body. Samuel had dismissed these concerns as the imaginings of an overwrought young man. Now, staring at the photograph under Blackwood's magnifying glass, Samuel understood the horrible truth. Benjamin's shadow had been trying to warn them all along. The question that haunted everyone involved was simple, yet terrifying. If a shadow could reach backward through time to deliver a warning, why hadn't anyone understood its message? And what other warnings might be hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the knowledge to interpret them? Could Benjamin's death have been prevented if someone had known how to read the language of shadows? 3 competing theories emerged to explain the Carter brothers' impossible photograph. The first, proposed by Dr. Feldman, suggested a previously unknown interaction between silver halide crystals and electromagnetic fields. He theorized that Benjamin's intense emotional state had somehow influenced the photographic emulsion at a molecular level. Laboratory tests conducted at the Pennsylvania College supported this hypothesis to a limited degree. Feldman's team found trace amounts of an unidentified metallic compound within Benjamin's shadow area of the negative. However, this theory failed to explain why the shadow showed a future physical position rather than simply appearing distorted. The second theory came from Detective Inspector Raymond Holt of the Pennsylvania State Police. Holt had been quietly investigating reports of unusual deaths in rural communities since 1920. He believed the Carter case was part of a larger pattern involving staged accidents and insurance fraud. According to Holt's files, 17 similar cases had occurred across 3 counties between 1885 and 1890. Each involved a family photograph taken shortly before a seemingly accidental death. In every instance, careful examination revealed shadows that didn't match the subject's poses. Holt theorized that a traveling photographer was collaborating with local accomplices to stage elaborate murders. The modified photographs would serve as insurance against suspicion, appearing to predict inevitable accidents. But Holt's investigation stalled when he discovered that different photographers had taken each of the suspicious images. The traveling conspiracy theory collapsed under the weight of logistical impossibility. The third explanation came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Agatha Pemberton, a spiritualist from Boston. Pemberton had been studying what she called temporal bleeding since 1918. Her research suggested that moments of extreme trauma could create fissures in the fabric of time itself. These fissures allowed future events to cast shadows backward into the present. According to Pemberton's theory, Benjamin's destined death was so violent and certain that it created a temporal echo. The photograph captured not Benjamin as he was, but as he would be. Pemberton's supporting evidence included similar cases from England, France, and Germany. Each involved photographs that seemed to predict future tragedies through impossible shadow configurations. Her research indicated that the phenomenon occurred most frequently in areas with high iron content in the soil. Millbrook Township sat atop one of Pennsylvania's richest iron ore deposits. The iron, Pemberton argued, acted as a conductor for temporal energy, amplifying the echo effect. Critics dismissed her work as elaborate superstition wrapped in scientific language, but her predictions proved disturbingly accurate in 3 subsequent cases she investigated personally. Professor Blackwood found himself unable to fully endorse any of the 3 theories. Each explained certain aspects of the Carter photograph, while failing to address others. The scientific approach accounted for the physical anomaly, but ignored the prophetic accuracy. The criminal conspiracy explained the pattern, but couldn't overcome the logistical impossibilities. The temporal theory embraced the supernatural elements, but lacked empirical proof. What troubled Blackwood most was that all 3 investigators had reached the same unsettling conclusion. The Carter brothers' photograph suggests that some futures cast shadows longer than we ever imagined possible. At exactly 3:17 a.m. on March 8, 1926, the Millbrook Township fire bell began ringing frantically. The Carter farmhouse, vacant since Samuel's death the previous winter, was consumed by flames of unusual intensity. Fire Chief Moses Garrett arrived to find the structure burning from the inside out, with no apparent ignition source. The blaze was concentrated in the parlor, where the family photographs had been stored in wooden crates. Neighbors reported that the fire burned with an eerie blue-white light, unlike any wood fire they had witnessed. The temperature was so intense that the farmhouse's iron nails melted completely, leaving only charred timber frames. Yet the barn, standing merely 30 feet away, showed no heat damage whatsoever. Garrett's official report noted that the fire had burned in perfect geometric patterns, consuming only specific areas. The crate containing the Carter brothers' photograph was found completely intact amid the ashes. Inside, every photograph had been reduced to silver dust, except for the anomalous 1888 portrait. That single image remained perfectly preserved, showing no signs of heat damage or smoke exposure. The glass plate, negative, stored separately in the basement, had also survived unharmed. Deputy Marshal Frank Holloway investigated the incident as possible arson, but found no evidence of accelerants. The burn patterns suggested the fire had started simultaneously in 17 different locations within the parlor. Each ignition point corresponded exactly to where a photograph had been stored. Holloway's interviews with neighbors revealed additional disturbing details about the night of the fire. Mrs. Dorothy Crane, living a quarter-mile north, reported seeing figures moving inside the burning house. She described 3 silhouettes standing calmly in the parlor, as flames raged around them. When Holloway pressed for more specific details, Mrs. Crane became visibly distressed. She insisted that the figures had no shadows, despite the bright firelight surrounding them. Her husband, Theodore Crane, corroborated her testimony, but added an even more unsettling observation. He claimed the 3 figures were positioned exactly as the Carter brothers had stood in their 1888 photograph. The fire burned for exactly 45 minutes before extinguishing itself without intervention. No water had been applied to the blaze, yet it simply stopped burning at 4:02 a.m. In the morning light, investigators found something that defied all logical explanation. Burned into the parlor's stone foundation were 3 shadow shapes, perfectly preserved in the soot and ash. The shadows matched the positions of Samuel, Thomas, and Benjamin Carter from their photograph. But Benjamin's shadow burn showed the same impossible backward angle that had puzzled experts for months. The shadow appeared to have been burned into the stone from below, as if cast by flames instead of light. Professor Blackwood arrived that afternoon to document the scene before weather could disturb the evidence. His photographs of the shadow burns would later become crucial evidence in the expanding investigation. What he discovered in the ashes would force him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the case. Hidden beneath the debris of the photograph crate was a leather-bound journal that had belonged to Ezra Whitmore. The entries inside would reveal that the Carter brothers' photograph was not the first of its kind. Ezra Whitmore's recovered journal contained entries spanning from 1884 to 1891, written in his meticulous photographer's hand. The entries revealed a pattern of impossible photographs that had haunted Whitmore throughout his career. His first encounter with shadow anomalies occurred in September 1884 during a portrait session for the Brennan family. Young Michael Brennan's shadow had appeared to show him hanging from a rope, despite his upright pose. 6 weeks later, Michael was found dead in his father's tobacco barn, having apparently taken his own life. Whitmore initially attributed the shadow discrepancy to a flaw in his glass plates or developing chemicals. But subsequent cases forced him to confront a more disturbing possibility. The Morrison twins, photographed in March 1885, showed shadows that appeared to be drowning. Their bodies stood dry on solid ground, but their shadows seemed to writhe beneath invisible water. Both boys drowned in Miller's Creek the following month, during what should have been a routine fishing expedition. By 1886, Whitmore was deliberately examining every photograph for shadow irregularities before delivery to clients. His journal entries became increasingly frantic as he documented case after case of prophetic images. The Henderson baby, photographed for a christening portrait, cast no shadow at all in the finished image. The child died of influenza before reaching his first birthday, as if he had never fully existed in the world. Mrs. Elizabeth Sawyer's portrait showed her shadow split in two, one half reaching toward heaven. She died in childbirth 7 months later, her spirit seemingly divided between this world and the next. Whitmore began refusing certain portrait commissions, claiming technical difficulties with his equipment. But the shadow prophecies continued appearing in photographs he couldn't avoid taking. His journal reveals desperate attempts to understand and control the phenomenon. He experimented with different cameras, various chemical developers, and alternative lighting setups. Nothing prevented the shadows from revealing futures that hadn't yet come to pass. In his entry dated October 20th, 1888, Whitmore described his growing dread about the upcoming Carter Brothers session. He had dreamed repeatedly of Benjamin's twisted shadow 4 nights before the appointment. The dream was so vivid that Whitmore sketched Benjamin's prophetic shadow pose in his journal margins. The sketch matched perfectly with what would appear in the developed photograph 4 days later. Whitmore's final entries, written in November 1891, revealed his decision to abandon photography entirely. He had realized that his camera wasn't simply capturing light and shadow. It was somehow accessing a realm where all possibilities existed simultaneously. The last entry, dated November 30th, 1891, contained only a single haunting line. Whitmore wrote, "I have seen too many deaths before their time, and I fear my own shadow grows strange." He disappeared from Millbrook that winter, leaving behind his studio and all his equipment. Local records show that his body was never found, but his camera was discovered in Miller's Creek, the same creek where the Morrison twins had drowned 6 years earlier. Professor Blackwood's analysis of Whitmore's journal revealed 17 documented cases of prophetic shadows. Each photograph had preceded a death that occurred within months of the portrait session. The implications were staggering. Whitmore had unknowingly operated as an oracle of death for nearly 8 years. How many other photographers might be documenting futures they don't understand, one shadow at a time? In 1963, during renovation of the Millbrook Historical Society building, workers discovered a sealed trunk in the basement archives. The trunk contained Professor Blackwood's complete research files, including photographs he had never made public. Among the materials was a letter addressed to whoever finds this collection, dated December 25th, 1926. Blackwood's letter revealed that he had continued investigating shadow anomalies until his death in 1927. His research had expanded beyond Millbrook to include similar cases across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. The pattern was always identical: family portraits preceding unexpected deaths, with shadows that defied physics and predicted the future. Blackwood had documented 43 confirmed cases spanning from 1882 to 1926. In each instance, the prophetic photograph had been taken by a different photographer using different equipment. This eliminated any possibility of a single contaminated camera or chemical batch causing the phenomenon. His final theory, outlined in meticulous detail, proposed that certain individuals existed simultaneously across multiple time streams. These temporally displaced people cast shadows from their moment of death backward through their entire lives. Photography, being a process that captured light at precise moments, sometimes revealed these temporal overlaps. Blackwood's research suggested that the phenomenon was increasing in frequency as photographic technology improved. He predicted that by the end of the 20th century, shadow prophecies would become commonplace. His letter ended with a warning: those who study these cases too closely risk becoming subjects themselves. The renovation workers also found Blackwood's personal camera among the archived materials. When they developed the film still inside, they discovered something that validated his final fears. The roll contained a self-portrait Blackwood had apparently taken shortly before his death. In the photograph, his shadow showed him falling down a flight of stairs. Blackwood's death certificate, dated February 14, 1927, listed the cause as injuries sustained in a fall down the stairs of his home. Modern digital analysis of the Carter brothers' photograph, conducted in 2019, has yielded new disturbing evidence. High-resolution scanning revealed details invisible to earlier investigators, using only magnification. Benjamin's prophetic shadow contains what appears to be text, written in letters formed by variations in shadow density. The message, decoded using computer enhancement software, reads, "The camera sees what time sees." Today, the Carter brothers' photograph hangs in the Smithsonian Institution's collection of unexplained phenomena. Visitors often report feeling watched while viewing the image, as if Benjamin's shadow continues to observe them. Security cameras monitoring the display case have occasionally captured impossible footage. Sometimes, Benjamin's shadow appears to move independently of the photograph, reaching toward viewers who linger too long. The question that haunts researchers today is whether we've learned to read the warnings that photographs have always contained. In our age of digital imagery and instant documentation, how many prophetic shadows do we ignore daily? Every family portrait, every social media selfie, every security camera capture might contain glimpses of futures we're not prepared to see. The Carter brothers' case suggests that some truths about death and time exist just beyond our perception, hidden in plain sight within every play of light and shadow. Perhaps Benjamin Carter's twisted shadow was never a prediction of his future. Perhaps it was simply the first time someone bothered to look closely enough to see what was always there. The next time you examine a family photograph, pay attention to the shadows. They might be trying to tell you something you're not ready to hear.